Hi you guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy you're here. Today we're going to be reading part 2 of PenPal. If you haven't already watched part 1, it is posted on my channel, so make sure you watch that one first. The stories should make sense individually, but you'll miss the overarching theme of all of them. Disclaimer, these are not my stories, I did not write them. And without further ado, let's jump right in. Boxes. If you haven't read Footsteps or Balloons, please do so before reading what's below so you'll understand. That's in part 1. For those of you who have read my other stories and asked if there was more and received cryptic answers from me, I want to apologize for being dishonest. I said several times in the comments that nothing really happened after Footsteps, but that wasn't true. The events of the following story weren't locked away in the recesses of my mind. I've always remembered them. It wasn't until I remembered Balloons and spoke with my mother about the following events that I realized how intertwined the story was with everything else. But I originally hadn't really planned on sharing this anyway. My desire to withhold this memory was due mostly to the fact that I don't think I showed good judgment in it. I also wanted consent from another person to tell it, so as to not misrepresent what transpired. I didn't expect there to be a lot of interest in my other stories, so I never thought I'd really get pressed for more details, and I would have been happy to keep this to myself for the rest of my life. I haven't been able to reach the other party, but I would feel disingenuous with withholding this story from those who wanted more information, now that I've spoken with my mother, and another connecting line that has been drawn. What follows is as accurate a recollection as I could manage. I apologize for the length. I spent the summer before my first year of elementary school learning how to climb trees. There was one particular pine tree right outside my house that seemed almost designed for me. It had branches that were so low I could easily grab them without a boost, and for the first couple days after I first learned how to pull myself up, I would just sit on the lowest branch dangling my feet. The tree was outside our back fence and was easily visible from the kitchen window, which was just above the sink. Before too long, my mother and I developed a routine where I would go play on the tree when she washed the dishes because she could easily see me while she did other things. As the summer passed, my abilities grew, and before too long, I was climbing fairly high. As the tree got taller, its branches not only got thinner, but more widely spaced. I eventually reached a point where I couldn't actually climb any higher, and so the game had to change. I began to concentrate on speed, and in the end, I could reach my highest branch in 25 seconds. I got too confident, and one afternoon I tried to step from a branch before I had firmly grasped the next one. I fell about 20 feet and broke my arm really badly in 2 places. My mom was running toward me yelling, and I remember her sounding like she was underwater. I don't remember what she said, but I do remember being surprised by just how white my bone was. I was going to start kindergarten with a cast and wouldn't even have any friends to sign it. My mom must have felt terrible because the day before I started school, she brought home a kitten. He was just a baby, and he was striped with tan and white. As soon as she put him down, he crawled into an empty case of soda that was sitting on the floor. I named him Boxes. Boxes was only an outside cat when he escaped. My mom had him declawed so he wouldn't destroy the furniture, so as a result, we did our best to keep him inside. He'd get out every now and then we'd find him somewhere in the backyard chasing some kind of bug or lizard, though we could hardly ever catch one because he had no front claws. He was pretty evasive, but we'd always catch him and carry him back inside. He'd scramble to look back over my shoulder. I told my mom that it was because he was planning his strategy for the next time. Once inside, we gave him some tuna fish, and he came to learn what the sound of the can opener might signal. He'd come running whenever he heard it. This conditioning came in handy later because toward the end of our time in that house, Boxes would get out much more often and would run under the house into the crawl space where neither of us wanted to follow because it was cramped and probably crawling with bugs and rodents. Ingeniously, my mom thought to hook the can opener to an extension cord out back and run it right outside the hole that Boxes had gone through. Eventually, he would emerge with his loud meows, looking excited by the sound and then horrified at how he could run such a cruel ruse on him. A can opener with no tuna made no sense to Boxes. The last time he escaped to under the house was actually our last day in it. My mom had put the house on the market and we had begun packing our things. We didn't have much and we stretched the packing out a while, though I had already packed up all my clothes at my mom's request. My mom could tell I was really sad about moving and wanted the transition to be smooth for me, and I guess she thought that having my clothes in the box would reinforce the idea that we were moving, but things wouldn't change that much. When Boxes got out as we were loading some things into the moving van, my mom cursed because she had already packed the can opener and wasn't sure where it was. I pretended to go look for it so I wouldn't have to go into the house, and my mom, probably completely aware of my little scam, moved one of the panels and crawled in. She came out with Boxes pretty quickly and seemed pretty unnerved, which made me feel even better about getting out of it. My mom made some phone calls while I packed a little more, and then she came into my room and told me that she had spoken to the realtor and we were going to start moving into the other house that day. She said it like it was excellent news, but I had thought we had more time in the house. She originally said that we weren't moving until the end of the next week, and it was only Tuesday. What's more, we weren't completely finished packing. But my mom said sometimes it was just easier to replace things than pack them and haul them all over the city. I didn't even get to grab the rest of my box clothes. I asked if I could call Josh to say bye, and she said that we could just call him from our new house. We left in the moving van. I managed to stay in touch with Josh for years, which is surprising since we no longer went to the same school. Our parents weren't close friends, but they knew that we were, and so they would accommodate our desire to see one another by driving us back and forth for sleepovers. sometimes every weekend. For Christmas one year, our parents even pooled their money and got us some really nice walkie-talkies that were advertised to work across a range that extended past the distance between our houses. They also had batteries that could last for days if the walkie-talkie was on but not used. They would only occasionally work well enough that we could talk across the city, but when we stayed over, we'd use them around the house, talking in mock radio speak that we had taken from movies, and they worked great for that. Thanks to our parents, we were still friends when we were 10. One weekend I was staying over at Josh's, and my mom called me to say goodnight. She was still pretty watchful even when she couldn't actually watch me, but I had gotten so used to it that I didn't even notice it, even if Josh did. She sounded upset. Boxes was missing. This must have been a Saturday night, because I had spent the night at Josh's the previous night and was going to go home the next day because we had school on Monday. Boxes had been missing since Friday afternoon. I gathered that she had not seen him since returning home after dropping me off. She must have decided to tell me he was missing because if he didn't come home before I did, then I would be devastated. Not only at his absence, but how she could have kept it from me. She told me not to worry. He'll come back. He always does. But Boxes didn't come back. 3 weekends later, I stayed at Josh's again. I was still upset about Boxes, but my mom told me that there had been many times when pets had disappeared from home for weeks, or even months, only to return on their own. She said they always knew where home was and would always try to get back. I was explaining this to Josh when a thought hit me so hard that I interrupted my own sentence to say it out loud. What if Boxes thought of the wrong home? Josh was confused. What? He lives with you. He knows where his home is. But he grew up somewhere else, Josh. He was raised in my old house a couple neighborhoods away. Maybe he still thinks that place is home like I do. Oh, I get it. Well, that'd be great. We'll tell my dad tomorrow and he'll take us over there so we can look. No, he won't, man. My mom said we couldn't ever go back to that place because the new owners wouldn't want to be bothered. She said that she told your mom and dad the same thing. Josh persisted. Okay, then we'll just go out exploring tomorrow and make our way to your old house. No! If we get spotted, your dad will find out and then so will my mom. We have to go there ourselves. We have to go there tonight. It didn't take that much convincing to get Josh on board since he was usually the one to come up with ideas like this. But we had never snuck out of this house before. It actually turned out to be incredibly easy. The window in his room opened to the backyard, and he had a latched wooden fence that wasn't locked. After those 2 minor hurdles, we slipped off into the night, flashlights and walkie-talkies in hand. There were 2 ways to get from Josh's house to my old house. We could walk on the street and make all the turns, or go through the woods, which would take about half the time. It would have taken about 2 hours to walk there taking the street, but I suggested that we go that way anyway. I told him it was because I didn't want to get lost. Josh refused and said that if we were seen, they might recognize him and tell his dad. He threatened to go home if we didn't just take the shortcut, and I accepted it because I didn't want to go by myself. Josh didn't know about the last time I walked through these woods at night. We have to put the hair up so we can walk in. The woods were much less creepy with a friend and a flashlight, and we were making pretty good time. I wasn't entirely sure where we were, but Josh seemed confident enough, and that bolstered my morale. We passed through a particularly thick patch of tangled trees when the strap of my walkie-talkie got caught in a branch. Josh had the flashlight, and so I was struggling to get the walkie free when I heard Josh say, "Hey man, want to go for a swim?" I looked over to where he was shining the flashlight, though I closed my eyes as I did because I now knew where we were. He was pointing at the pool float. This was where I had woken up in these woods all those years ago. I felt a lump in my throat and the sting of fresh tears in my eyes as I continued to struggle with the walkie. Frustrated, I yanked on it hard enough to break it free, and I turned and walked to Josh, who had partially laid down on the pool float in a mock sunbathing pose. As I walked toward him, I stumbled and nearly fell into a fairly large hole that was sitting in the middle of the small clearing, but I regained my balance and stopped right at its edge. It was deep. I was surprised by the size of the hole, but more surprised by the fact that I didn't remember it. I realized it must not have been there that night because it was in the same spot where I had awoken. I put it out of my mind and turned to Josh. "Quit messing around, man. You saw I was stuck over there and you were just laying here joking around on this float." I punctuated that sentence with a kick to an exposed part of the float. A screeching rose from it. Josh's smile inverted. He suddenly looked terrified and was struggling to get off the float, but he couldn't in a quick manner due to the awkward way he had been laying on it. Each time he would fall back on the float, the screeching would intensify. I wanted to help Josh, but I couldn't move any closer. My legs wouldn't cooperate. I hated these woods. I picked up the flashlight that he had thrown in his thrashing and shined it on the float, not knowing what to expect. Finally, Josh got off the float and rushed next to me, looking at where I was shining the light. Suddenly, there it was. It was a rat. I started laughing nervously, and we both watched the rat run into the woods, taking the screeches with it. Josh slightly punched me in the arm, the smile slowly returning to his face, and we continued walking. We quickened our pace and made it out of the woods faster than we thought we would, and we found ourselves back in my old neighborhood. The last time I had rounded the bend ahead, I had seen my house fully illuminated, and all the memories of what transpired came flooding back. I felt a skipping in my heart as we were finally turning the corner and about to face the full view of my house, remembering last time. but this time all the lights were off. From a distance, I could see my own climbing tree, and as my mind traced the steps of casualty backward, I realized that I wouldn't be here this night if that tree hadn't grown, and I was briefly in awe of how all the events were like that. As we got closer, I could see the lawn looked terrible. I couldn't even guess when it had last been mowed. One of the shutters had partially broken loose and was rocking back and forth in the breeze, and overall the house just looked dirty. I was sad to see my home in such a state of disrepair. Why would Mom care if we bothered the new owners if they cared so little about where they lived? And then I realized there were no new owners. The house was abandoned, though it looked simply forsaken. Why would my mom lie to me about our house having new people in it? But I thought this actually was a good thing. It would be easier to look around for boxes if we didn't have to worry about being spotted by the new family. This would make it much quicker. Josh interrupted my thoughts as we walked through the gate and up to the house itself. "Your old house sucks, dude," Josh yelled as quietly as he could. "Shut up, Josh. Even like this, it's still nicer than your house." "Hey, man. Okay, I think boxes is probably under the house. One of us has to go under and look, but the other should stay next to the opening in case he comes running out." "Are you serious? There's no way I'm going under there. It's your cat, man. You do it." "Look, I'll game you for it, unless you're too scared," I said, holding my fist over my upturned hand. "Fine, but we go on shoot, not on 3. It's rock, paper, scissors, shoot, not 1, 2, 3. "I know how to play the game, Josh. You're the one who always messes that up, and it's 2 out of 3. I lost. I wiggled loose the panel that my mom would always move when we had to crawl under here for boxes. She only had to do it a couple of times since the can opener trick usually worked, but when she had to do it, she hated it, especially the last time. And as I looked into the darkness of the crawl space, I had greater appreciation for why. Before we moved, she said that it was actually better that boxes ran under there, despite how hard it could be to get them out. It was less dangerous than him jumping over the fence and running around the neighborhood. All that was true, but I was still dreading doing this. I grabbed the flashlight and the walkie and began to crawl in. A powerful smell overtook me. It smelled like death. I turned on my walkie. "Josh, are you there?" "This is Macho Man. Come back." "Josh, cut it out. There's something wrong down here." "What do you mean?" "It stinks. It smells like something died." "Is it boxes?" "I really hope not." I set down the walkie and moved the flashlight around as I crawled forward. Looking through the hole from the outside, you could see all the way back with the right lighting, but you had to be inside to see around the support blocks that held the house up. I'd say there was about 40% of that area that you couldn't see unless you were actually in the crawl space. But even inside, I discovered that I could only see directly where the flashlight was pointing. I realized that this would make scouting around the place much more difficult. As I moved forward, the smell intensified. The fear was growing in me that boxes had come here and something had happened to him. I shined the flashlight around but couldn't see much of anything. I wrapped my fingers around a support block to pull myself forward, and as I did that, I felt something that made my hand recoil. Fur. My heart sank, and I prepared myself emotionally for what I was about to see. I crawled slowly so I could prolong what I knew was coming, and inched my eyes in the flashlight past the block to see what was on the other side. I staggered back in horror. "Jesus Christ!" escaped my trembling mouth. It was a hideous and twisted creature, badly decomposed. Its skin had rotted away on its face, so the teeth appeared to be enormous, and the smell was unbearable. "What is it? Are you okay? Is it boxes?" I reached for the walkie. No, it's not boxes." "Well, what the hell is it then?" "I don't know." I shined the light on it again and looked at it with less fear in my vision. I chuckled. "It's a raccoon." "Well, keep looking. I'm gonna go into the house to see if he might have made it in there somehow." "What? No, Josh, don't go in there. What if Boxes is down here and runs out?" "He can't. I put the board back." I looked and saw that he was telling the truth. "Why'd you do that?" "Don't worry, man. You can move it easy. This makes more sense. If Boxes ran out and I missed him, then he'd be gone. If he's down there, then grab him tight and I'll come move the board, and if he's not, then you can move it yourself while I look in the house." Some of his points were good, and I doubted he'd be able to get in anyway. "Okay, but be careful and don't touch anything. There's a bunch of my old clothes still in boxes in my room. You can look in there to see if he crawled in one, and make sure to bring your walkie." "Roger that. Good, buddy." I realized that it would be pitch black in there. The power would have been turned off since no one was paying the bill. With any luck, he'd be able to see from the street lights that might cast some light inside. Otherwise, I'm not sure what he'd do. Before too long, I heard footsteps right over my head, and felt old dirt raining down on me. "Josh, is that you?" "Shh, breaker, this is Macho Man, coming back for the big tango foxtrot. The eagle has landed. What's your 20, Princess Jasmine? Over?" Asshole. "Macho Man, my 20 is in your bathroom looking at your stash of magazines. Looks like you got a thing for dudes' butts. What's the report on that? Over." I could hear him laughing without the walkie, and started laughing too. I heard the footsteps fade away a little, and he was on his way to my room. Man, it's dark in here. Hey, are you sure you had boxes of clothes in there? I don't see any. Yeah, there should be a couple boxes in front of the closet. There aren't any boxes in here. Let me check to see if you maybe put the boxes in the closet before you left. I started thinking that maybe my mom had come back and gotten the clothes and just given them away because I had outgrown them, but I remembered leaving the boxes there. I didn't even have time to close the last one up before we left. While I was waiting for Josh to tell me what he found, I kicked out my leg, which had started falling asleep because of the position I was in, and it hit something. I looked back and saw something really strange. It was a blanket, and all around it there were bowls. I crawled a little closer to it, and the blanket smelled moldy, and most of the bowls were empty, but one had something that I recognized still in it. Cat food. It was a different kind than we gave to boxes, but I suddenly understood. My mom had set up a little places for boxes to encourage him to come here instead of running around the neighborhood. That made a lot of sense, and it seemed even more likely that boxes would have come back to this place. That's so cool, Mom, I thought. I found your clothes. Oh, cool. Where were the boxes? Like I said, there are no boxes. Your clothes are in your closet. They're hanging up. I felt a chill. This was impossible. I had packed all of my clothes. Even though we weren't supposed to move for another 2 weeks when we left, I remember packing them and thinking that it was stupid for me to have to get clothes out of the box and put them back in. I had packed them, but someone had hung them back up. Why though? Josh needed to get out of there. That can't be right, Josh. They're supposed to be in boxes. Stop messing around and just come back outside. No joke, man. I'm looking at them. Maybe you just thought you left them. Haha, wow. You sure like to look at yourself, don't you? What? What do you mean? Your walls, man. Haha. Your walls are covered in Polaroids of yourself. There are hundreds of them. What, did you hire someone to... Silence. I checked my walkie to see if I had switched it off somehow. It was fine. I could hear footsteps but couldn't tell where Josh was going. I waited for Josh to finish the sentence, thinking that his finger had just slipped off the button, but he didn't continue. He seemed to be stomping around the house now. I was just about to radio him when he came back. There's someone in the house. His voice was hushed and broken. I could hear he was on the verge of tears. I wanted to respond, but how loud was his walkie turned up? What if the other person heard it? I said nothing and just waited and listened. What I heard were footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps. And then a loud thud. Oh God. Josh. He had been found. I was sure of it. This person had found him and was hurting him. I broke out in tears. He was my only friend next to boxes. And then I realized, what if Josh told him I was under here? What could I possibly do? As I struggled to compose myself, I thankfully heard Josh's voice through the walkie. He's got something, man. It's a big bag. He just threw it on the floor and... Oh God, man. The bag. I think it just moved. I was paralyzed. I wanted to run home. I wanted to save Josh. I wanted to go for help. I wanted so many things, but I just lay there, frozen. As I lay unable to move, my eyes focused on the corner of the house that was right under my room. I moved my flashlight. My breath hitched at what I saw. Animals. Dozen of them. All of them dead. They lay in piles all around the perimeter of the crawl space. Could boxes be among these corpses? Was this what the cat food was for? Seeing this broke my shock as I knew I had to get out of there and scrambled to the board. I pushed on it, but it wouldn't budge. I couldn't move it because it was wedged in there, and I couldn't get my fingers around it since the edges were outside. I was trapped. God damn you, Josh, I whispered to myself. I could feel thunderous footsteps above me. The house was shaking. I heard Josh scream, and it was matched by another scream that wasn't full of fear. As I continued pushing, I felt the board move, but I knew it wasn't me who was moving it. I could hear footsteps above me and in front of me, and shouting and screaming filling the brief silences between the footsteps. I moved back and held my walkie, ready to try to defend myself, and the board was thrown to the side, and an arm shot in and grabbed for me. Let's go, man, now! It was Josh. Thank God. I scrambled out of the opening, holding the flashlight and the walkie. When we got to the fence, we both jumped it, but Josh's walkie fell. He reached for it, and I told him to forget it. We had to move. Behind us, I could hear yelling, though they weren't words, only sounds, and we, perhaps foolishly, ran for the woods to get back to Josh's quicker and be somewhat harder to follow. The whole way through the woods, Josh kept yelling, "My picture! He took my picture!" But I knew the man already had Josh's picture from all those years ago at the ditch. I suppose Josh still thought those mechanical sounds were from a robot. We made it back to Josh's house and back into his room before his parents woke up. I asked him about the big bag and if it really moved, and he said he couldn't be sure. He kept apologizing about dropping the walkie at the house, but obviously that wasn't a big deal. We didn't go to sleep and sat peering out the window waiting for him. I went home later that day as it was about 3 a.m. already. I told my mom the basics of the story a couple days ago. She broke down and was furious about the danger I put myself in. I asked her why she made up all those things about bothering the new owners to stop me from going. Why did she think the house was so dangerous? She became irate and hysterical, but she answered my question. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it harder than I thought her capable of, and locked her eyes to mine, whispering as if she was afraid of being overheard. Because I never put any fucking blankets or bowls under the house for boxes. You weren't the only one to find them. I felt dizzy. I understood so much now. I understood why she had looked so uneasy after she brought boxes out from under the house on our last day there. She found more than spiders or a rat's nest that day. I understand why we left almost 2 weeks early. I understood why she tried to stop me from going back. She knew. She knew he made his home under ours, and she kept it from me. I left without saying another word and didn't finish the story for her. But I want to finish it here, for you. I got home from Josh's that day. I threw my stuff on the floor and it scattered everywhere. I didn't care, I just wanted to sleep. I woke up around 9 p.m. to the sound of boxes meowing. My heart leapt. He had finally come home. I was a little sick about the fact that if I had just waited a day, none of the previous night's events would have happened, and I'd have boxes anyway. But that didn't matter. He was back. I got off my bed and called for him, looking around to catch a glint of light in his eyes. The crying continued, and I followed it. It was coming from under the bed. I laughed a little, thinking I had just crawled under a house looking for him, and now this was much better. His meows were being muffled by his shirt, so I flung it aside and smiled, yelling, "Welcome home, Boxes!" His cries were coming from my walkie-talkie. Boxes never came home. Maps. There was a comment in the last post that made me remember an event from my childhood that I always looked as odd, but never considered it to be related to any of these stories. I know now that it is. It's funny how memories work. The details might all be present in your mind, though scattered and disarrayed, and then a single thought can stitch them back together almost instantly. I never thought of these events much because I was focused on the wrong details. I went back to my mom's house and went through my old childhood schoolwork looking for something that I think is important. I couldn't find it, but I'll keep looking. Again, sorry for the length. Most old cities and the neighborhoods in them weren't planned with the thought that the population would begin to grow exponentially and would have to be accommodated. The layout of the roads is generally originally in response to geographical restrictions and the necessity of connecting points of economic importance. Once the connecting roads are established, new businesses and roads are positioned strategically along the existing skeleton, and eventually the paths carved into the earth are immortalized in asphalt, leaving room only for minor modifications, additions, and alterations, but never a dramatic change. My childhood neighborhood must have been old then. If straight lines move as the crow flies, then my neighborhood must have been built based around the travels of a snake. The first houses built must have been placed around the lake, and gradually the inhabitable area increased as new extensions were built off the original path. But these new extensions all ended abruptly at one point or another. There was only one entrance/exit for the entire neighborhood. Many of these extensions were limited by a tributary which both fed and drank from the lake and passed right by what I came to call, and have called in these stories, the ditch. Many of the original homes had enormous yards, but some of those original plots had been divided, leaving properties with smaller and smaller boundaries. An aerial view of my neighborhood would give one the impression that an enormous squid had once died in the woods, and some adventuring entrepreneur found the corpse and paved roads over its tentacles, only to withdraw his involvement and leave time, greed, and desperation to divide up the land among prospective homeowners, like an embarrassing attempt at the golden ratio. From my porch you could see the old houses that surrounded the lake, but the house of Mrs. Maggie was my favorite. She was, as best as I can remember, around 80 years old, but despite that, she was one of the friendliest people I had ever met. She had a head of loose-set white curls, and always wore light dresses with floral patterns. She would talk to me and Josh from her back porch when we were swimming in the lake, and she would always invite us in for snacks. She said that she was lonely because her husband Tom was always away on business, but Josh and I would always decline her invitation because, as nice as Mrs. Maggie was, there was still something odd about her. Every now and then we would swim away. She would say, "Christian John, you're welcome here any time," and we could hear her still yelling that when we were walking back into my house. Mrs. Maggie, like many of the older homeowners, had a sprinkler system that was on a timer, though at some point over the years her timer must have broken because the sprinklers would come on at various points during the day, and often even at night all year. While it never got cold enough to snow very much, several times each winter I would go outside in the morning to see Mrs. Maggie's yard transformed into a surreal Arctic paradise by the frozen water. Every other yard stood sterilized and dry by the biting frost of the winter's cold, but right there in the middle of the bleak reminder of the savagery of the season was an oasis of beautiful ice hanging like stalactites from every branch of every tree and every leaf of every bush. As the sun rose, it reflected off, and each piece of ice splintered into the sun into a rainbow that would only be viewed briefly before it blinded you. Even as a child, I was struck by how beautiful it was, and often Josh and I would go over there to walk in the iced grass and have sword fights with the icicles. I once asked my mom why she left it on like that. My mom seemed to search for the explanation before she said, "Well, sweetie, Mrs. Maggie is sick a lot, and sometimes when she gets really sick, she gets confused. That's why she messes up yours and Josh's name sometimes. She doesn't mean to, but sometimes she just can't remember. She lives in that big house all by herself, so it's okay if you talk to her when you swim in the lake, but when she invites you in, you should keep saying no. Be polite. Her feelings won't get hurt." But she'll be less lonely when her husband comes home, though, right? How long will he be away on business? It seems like he's always away. My mom seemed to struggle, and I could see that she had become very upset. Finally, she answered, "Honey, Tom's not going to come home. Tom's in heaven. He died years and years ago, but Mrs. Maggie doesn't remember. She gets confused and forgets, but Tom's not ever going to come home. If someone moved back in with her, she might even think it was Tom. But he's gone, sweetie." I would have only been around 5 or 6 when she told me that, and while I didn't understand it completely, I was still profoundly sad for Mrs. Maggie. I know now that Mrs. Maggie had Alzheimer's. She and her husband Tom had 2 sons, Chris and John. The 2 had worked out payment plans with the utility companies and paid for Mrs. Maggie's water and electricity, but they would never visit her. I don't know if something happened between them or if it was the illness, or if they just lived too far away, but they never came around. I have no idea what they looked like, but there were times when Mrs. Maggie must have thought Josh and I looked like they did when they were children. Or maybe she saw what some part of her mind so desperately wanted her to see, ignoring the images transmitted down her optic nerve, and just for a little while showing her what it used to be. I realize only now how lonely she must have been. During the summer after kindergarten, before the events of balloons, Josh and I had taken to exploring the woods near my house, as well as the tributary of the lake. We knew that the woods between our houses were connected, and we thought it would be neat if the lake near my house was somehow connected to the creek around his, so we resolved ourselves to find out. We were going to make maps. The plan was to make 2 separate maps and then combine them. We would make one map exploring the area around the creek near his house, and make another following the outflow from my lake. Originally, we were going to make one map, but we realized that wasn't possible since I had started drawing the map of my area so huge that the route from his house wouldn't have been to scale. We kept the map from the lake at my house and the map from the creek at his house, and we would add to each when we stayed the night with each other. For the first couple weeks, it went really well. We would walk through the woods along the water and pause every couple minutes to add to the map, and it seemed like the 2 maps would come together any day. We had no equipment needed for the job, not even a compass, but we tried to make do. We had the idea to impale the earth with a stick when we reached the end of the venture, so if we came upon the stick from the other direction the next weekend, we would know we had joined the maps. We might have been the world's worst cartographers. Eventually, however, the woods became too thick near the water coming from the lake, and we were unable to proceed further. We lost interest in the whole project for a bit, and reduced our exploration significantly, though not completely, when we started selling snow cones. After I showed my mom all the pictures I had taken home from school, and she took away my snow cone machine, our interest in the maps revitalized. We had to come up with another plan. Although I didn't understand why, my mom had placed what I considered to be extremely severe restrictions on what I could do and where I could go, and I had to check in frequently if I went outside to play with Josh. This meant that we couldn't stay in the woods for hours and continue to look for a new path. We thought that we could just swim when we got to the cutoff in the woods, but that clearly wouldn't work since the map would get wet. We tried going faster when we were coming from Josh's house, but we eventually ran into the same problem. Then we had a brilliant idea. We'd build a raft. Due to the construction in the neighborhood, there was a large amount of scrap building material that the company would set in the ditch to keep it out of the road and off-site, since they no longer needed it for building. We originally conceived a formidable ship complete with a mast and anchor, but this quickly diminished into something more manageable. We set aside the wood and took several large pieces of styrofoam that were backed with foam board and tied them together with a rope and a kite string. We launched our vessel a little downwater from Mrs. Maggie and waved farewell to her as she motioned for us to come by her way. But there was no stopping us. The raft worked very well, and while we both behaved and spoke as if the functionality of the raft was a given, I know at least I was a little surprised. We each had a fairly long tree branch to use as a paddle, but we found it was easier to simply push against the land under the water than actually use them as intended. When the water became too deep, we'd simply lie on our stomachs and use our hands to paddle the water, which still worked, albeit less well. The first time we had to resort to that method of propulsion, I remember thinking that from far above it must have looked like a colossally fat man with tiny arms was out for a swim. It actually took us several trips to get the raft to the impassable patch of woods that marked the farthest we had made it. After we had come up with the idea of marking the ground with a stick, we had taken to running through the woods until we got to that stick, and then as carefully and precisely as we knew how, charting our course. This meant that the impasse was actually quite a bit away, so to sail from around my house all the way to the blockade in the woods was taking longer than expected. We'd sail for a bit and then dock the raft, and then next time we'd run through the woods to the raft and go a little further. We continued this well into first grade. Josh and I were assigned to different groups that year, so we didn't really see one another during the school day. Our parents were more than willing to let us hang out all weekend each week. What's more, Josh's dad had taken on a lengthy construction job that required him to work over the weekends, and his mother was on call, so this meant that Josh would stay at my house most every weekend for weeks on end. We should have been making excellent progress, but when we finally made it to the impasse and had the opportunity to explore past it, we couldn't find a place to dock the raft. The woods were simply too thick, and the water had eroded the land to the point that there was nearly a 2-foot rise of earth over the tributary, which exposed the twisting and damp roots of the trees above. We'd have to turn back every time and leave the raft at the same thicket of trees that prompted us to build it in the first place. Even worse, winter had arrived, so we couldn't justify leaving the house in our swimsuits. We were getting nowhere. We'd always have to come home before we could gain much ground. On a Saturday around 7 p.m., Josh and I were playing when one of my mom's co-workers knocked on our door. Her name was Samantha, and I remember her well now because I would propose to her a couple years later when I was visiting my mom at work. My mom said that she had to go to work to fix a problem that had arisen, and she'd be back in about 2 hours. Her car was being repaired, so she'd have to ride with Samantha, but I gathered that the problem was Samantha's fault, and discussing it in the car was why it would only take 2 hours. She said that under no circumstances were we to leave the house or open the door for anyone, and she was in the middle of explaining that she would call every hour when she got there to check in. But she ended that statement prematurely when she remembered that our phone had been turned off for delinquent payments. This is why Samantha had just come by unannounced. She looked me dead in the eyes as she was closing the door and said, "Stay put." This was our chance. We watched her drive down the serpentine road toward the exit, and as soon as the car rounded the last visible bend, we ran back to my room. I dumped my backpack out while Josh grabbed the map. "Hey, do you have a flashlight?" Josh chimed. "No, but we'll be back way before dark." I was thinking just in case we should have one. "My mom has one, but I don't know where she keeps it." "Wait." I ran into my closet and pulled a box down from the top shelf. "You have a flashlight in there?" Josh asked. "Not exactly." I opened the box and revealed 3 Roman candles that I had taken from the pile that my mother had amassed for the 4th of July that past summer, along with a lighter that I had managed to take from her some months before. This would ensure that we at least had some light if we needed it. This was a little bit before I had been given an opportunity to be afraid of the woods at night, so it wasn't fear that motivated our search for a light source, only practicality. We threw it all in the backpack and bolted out the back door, making sure to close it so boxes wouldn't get out. We had 1 hour and 50 minutes. We ran through the woods as fast as we could, made it to our raft in about 15 minutes. We had our bathing suits on under our clothes. We stripped off our shirts and shorts and left them in 2 separate piles about 4 feet from the edge of the water. We untied the raft from the tree, grabbed our branch paddles, and cast off. We tried to move rapidly to reach a point beyond the contents of our ever-expanding map, as we didn't have time to waste seeing old sights. We knew that we were slower in the raft than on land, and that we would be in the raft for quite a while after the cutoff since the woods were too thick to walk through and there wasn't a place to dock. This meant that we'd have to ride the raft back to the original docking site, even if we found a new place to dock it further ahead. After we passed the last charted part of our map, the water began to get really deep, and eventually we could no longer touch the bottom with our tree branches, so we lay on our stomachs and paddled with our hands. It was getting darker, and as a result, it was becoming harder to distinguish the trees from one another, and we were both becoming slightly unnerved. In the interest of making good time, we were paddling fast with our arms, but this caused a lot of noise as our hands repeatedly confronted and then broke through the water's surface tension. During these periods, we could both hear the crunching of dead leaves and the snapping of falling sticks in the woods to our right. As we would slow our pace and quiet our actions, the rustling in the woods would cease, and we began to wonder if it was really ever there at all. We didn't know what kinds of animals resided this far into the woods, but we did know that we didn't want to find out. As Josh amended the map that I was illuminating with the lighter, we were suddenly confronted with the fact that the sounds were not imagined. Rapidly and rhythmically, we heard crunch, snap, crunch. It seemed to be moving slightly away from us, pushing through the woods just beyond our map. It had become too dark to see. We had misjudged how long the song would linger. Nervously, I called out, "Hello?" There was a brief moment of breathless tension as we lay static in the water. The silence was suddenly broken by laughter. "Hello?" Josh cackled. "So what?" "Hello, Mr. Monster in the Woods. I know you're sneaking around, but maybe you'll answer my hello? Hello!" I realized how stupid it was. Whatever animal it was, it wouldn't respond. I hadn't even realized I said it until afterwards, but if anything was actually there, I obviously wouldn't get a reply. Josh continued, "Hello!" in a high falsetto. "Hello!" I countered with the deepest baritone as I could manage. "Hello there, mate." "Hello, beep boop." "Hello." We both continued mocking each other, and were in the process of turning the raft around to head back when we heard, "Hello." It was whispered and forced as if it were powered by the last breath in a pair of deflating lungs. but it didn't sound sickly. It had come from the spot just off the map, which now sat behind us since we had turned the raft around. I slowly shifted on the raft and faced the direction of the sound as I fumbled with the Roman candle. I wanted to see. "What are you doing?" Josh hissed. But I already lit it. As the sparkling fuse sunk into the wrapper, I held it toward the sky. I had never actually shot one of these myself and thought to use it like a flare in the movies. A glowing green orb rocketed out toward the stars and then quickly exhausted. I lowered my arm more toward the horizon. I can remember that there were several colors, but I couldn't remember how many times one of these fired before being depleted. A second ball of red light burst out and fizzled above the trees, but I still saw nothing. "Let's just go, man," Josh pressed as he turned to face the direction back home and began paddling desperately. "Just one more." Lowering my arm directly at the woods in front of me, another red ball of fire was launched from the tube. It traveled straight ahead until it collided with the tree, briefly exploding the light in a much greater diameter. Still nothing. I dropped the firework in the water, and we watched as one more struggling fireball burst free, only to quickly die, suffocated by the water. As we began paddling in the direction toward my house, we heard a loud and unconcealed rustling in the woods. The breaking of branches and the trampling of fallen leaves overpowered the sound of our splashing. It was running. In our panic, we jostled the raft too violently and felt one of the ropes under my chest loosen. "Josh, be careful!" But it was too late. Our raft was breaking. Before too long, it had completely fallen apart. We each held onto a separate piece of styrofoam, but the pieces weren't big enough to keep us completely afloat, and our legs dangled beneath us in the winter water. "Josh, quick!" I yelled as I pointed at the water right next to him. He scrambled, but it was too cold to move quickly as we both watched the map floated away. "I'm cold, man," Josh shuddered. "Let's get out of the water." We approached the shore, but each time we attempted to pull ourselves up, we'd hear the frantic rustling thundering toward us from the woods just above. Eventually, we were too cold and weak to even try anymore. Steadily, we kicked our legs and found ourselves near the dock site. We toppled off the debris and tried to pull it on land, but Josh's piece slipped away and floated in the direction of the lake. We took off our swimsuits and were desperate to get into dry clothes to shield us from the biting cold of the air. I slid my shorts on, but there was something wrong. I turned to Josh. "Where's my shirt, man?" He shrugged and suggested, "Maybe it got knocked into the water and floated into the lake." I told Josh to go back to my house and to say that we were playing hide and seek if my mom was home. I had to try and find my shirt. I ran behind the houses and peered out over the water and scouted along the shoreline. It occurred to me that with any luck, maybe I could find the map too. I was moving pretty fast because I needed to get home, and I was about to give up when my concentration was interrupted by a sound coming from just behind me. "Hello." I whipped around. It was Mrs. Maggie. I'd never seen her at night before, and in this poor light she looked exceedingly frail. The usual warmth that wrapped her manner seemed to have been snuffed out by the chill. I couldn't remember ever seeing her without a smile, and so her face looked strange. "Hello, Mrs. Maggie." "Oh, hi, Chris." The warmth and smile had returned to her, even if her memories had not. "I couldn't see it was you in the dark there." Jokingly, I asked her if she was going to invite me in for a snack, but she said maybe another time. I was too busy looking for my map and the shirt to really engage her, but she sounded happy, so I didn't feel bad. She said a couple other things, but I was too distracted to pay attention. I said goodnight and ran down her driveway toward my house. Behind me, I could hear her walking across the frozen yard, but I didn't turn around to wave. I had to get home. I made it home a couple minutes before my mom did, and by the time she came in, Josh and I had already changed clothes and warmed up. We'd gotten away with it, even though we'd lost the map. Couldn't find it? Nah, but I saw Mrs. Maggie. She called me Chris again. I'm telling you, dude, just be glad you've never seen her at night. We both laughed, and he asked me if she'd invited me in for a snack, joking that the snacks must be terrible since she couldn't even give them away. I told him that she didn't, and he was surprised. And now that I had time to think about it, so was I. Literally every time we had seen her, she had invited us in for snacks. And here I had, albeit sarcastically, invited myself, and she said no. As just talked about Mrs. Maggie, I suddenly realized that the lighter might still be in my pocket, and that it would be disastrous for my mom to find. I grabbed the shorts off the floor and patted my pockets. I felt something, but it wasn't the lighter. From my back pocket, I slid out a folded piece of paper, and my heart leapt. The map? I thought, but I watched it float away. As I unfolded the paper, my stomach turned as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Drawn on the paper inside of a large oval were two stick figures holding hands. One was much bigger than the other, but neither had faces. The paper was torn, so a part of it was missing. There was a number written right near the top corner. It was either 15 or 16. I nervously handed Josh the paper and asked him if he had put it in my pocket at some point, but he scoffed at the idea and asked me why I was so upset. I pointed toward the smaller figure and what was written next to it. It was my initials. I shook it off and told Josh the rest of the conversation between Mrs. Maggie and I. I had always attributed the odd exchange to her being sick until revisiting the events in my mind all these years later. As I think about it now, the feeling of profound sadness for Mrs. Maggie returns, but it's augmented by a looming feeling of despair when I think about why she said maybe another time. I knew what she had said, but I didn't understand what it meant that night. I didn't understand what her words meant weeks later, when I watched men in strange orange biohazard suits carry what I thought were black bags full of garbage out of her house, why the whole neighborhood smelled like death that day. I still didn't understand when they condemned the house and boarded it up a little while before we moved. But I understand now. I understand why her last words to me were so important, even if neither she nor I realized it at the time. Mrs. Maggie had told me that night that Tom had come home, but I now know who had really moved in. Just as I now know why I never saw her body brought out on a stretcher. The bags weren't filled with garbage. And that is where we're going to end off part 2. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know it was a long one, so thank you so much for sticking with me. We will be finishing the story in part 3, so be on the lookout for that. If you enjoy this kind of content and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe to me here and also on my TikTok at Maddie Crosb, at MATTIECROSB. Appreciate you guys all so much. Thank you. I love you.